I love coasting financial independence. I've said it before, but it's worth saying again, especially in times where we're experiencing economic turbulence like we have been this past year or so. And I love it not necessarily because of the end goal of coasting FI, although that is quite a good part too, but because the ideas underpinning the philosophy can be so relevant and helpful even in the most trying times. In short, I believe that due to what's going on in the financial world right now, coasting financial independence might be even more beneficial to discuss today than it was the last time I covered it a couple of years ago. With that in mind, I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about one of my favorite aspects of the financial independence movement, and why I find it so relevant in a world that's fearing the onset of a prolonged economic recession and is grappling with rapidly rising costs. Let's talk about coasting financial independence. But before we get going, be sure to like this video if you haven't already, as it really does help out the channel a lot, and subscribe with notifications on for more money-related videos like this one every single week. And if you want to further support this channel, you can check out some of the links I've left in the description below, which includes a link to my Patreon page. This is the best way to show your support for this channel, and in addition to that, you can also get early access to new videos and exclusive content such as spreadsheets based off the ideas we discuss in these videos. The spreadsheets will allow you to play with your own numbers and see how big of a difference some of the ideas we discuss can make for your own personal financial situation. So first things first, for those who don't know, what is coasting financial independence? Put simply, coasting financial independence is a financial state where you have already managed to put away enough money to reach true financial independence by a specified point in time in the future, even if you were to never add another cent to your current investments. Basically, it's the point in time where the compound interest on your current investing nest egg is expected to allow your nest egg to grow by enough on its own to make you financially independent by the time you reach the age where you want to retire, whatever that age may be. Traditionally, you are considered to be truly financially independent when your nest egg has grown to be worth at least 25 times your annual expenses, per the 4% rule. So that gives you a rough target to shoot for. And that's about all there is to it. It's a pretty simple concept. This means that calculating your savings goal to reach coasting financial independence requires just 4 variables. The first variable is your spending budget, more specifically the amount you expect to spend once you've reached full financial independence. Finding this figure can be as easy as tracking your spending for a few months, or better yet, a year, and then making any adjustments that you expect to happen once you reach financial independence. For instance, if you plan to retire, you may expect to travel more than you do right now while you're working, so you may want to add a little bit more wiggle room in your budget to account for those additional long-term travel expenses. On the flip side, you may expect to spend less in some areas of your budget, like regular transportation costs for the commute to and from work that you'll obviously no longer be doing. Or depending on your financial plan between now and then, you may be able to pay off a mortgage so that you won't have to worry about that particular expense once you reach retirement. Those are just a few common examples, but depending on your financial situation, there could be many other adjustments that you might want to make. The second variable is your expected investment return in the future. This is obviously quite a bit more uncertain than calculating your expenses, since we don't know for sure what investment returns in the future might look like. However, we can get at least a decent guesstimate based on historical data, and then build in some artificial cushion to lower the likelihood of us falling short of our goals when all is said and done. The third variable is your current age. Pretty self-explanatory. And finally, the fourth variable is the age at which you wish to reach full financial independence. For a lot of people, this is the age that they want to retire at. However, not everybody chooses their target financial independence age in that way. Just to put some numbers to this whole concept, let's say that John and Jane were a 25-year-old couple taking home a combined $60,000 a year, with raises that keep pace with inflation, but never more than that. They have a savings rate of 50%, so their current annual expenses would be about $30,000. In other words, they're doing quite well when it comes to budgeting. We'll assume that the average inflation rate ends up being about 3% per year between now and the time they're 65, which is the age that they want to have reached full financial independence by. This means that their annual expenses when they retire at the age of 65 will come out to be a shade under $98,000 a year, and their full financial independence savings goal will therefore be about $2.45 million. Finally, we'll say that over the long run, their investment averages an annualized nominal return of about 10% per year, which is roughly what the S&P 500 has managed to achieve historically. If we plug those ages, expenses, and returns into a calculator, we'll find that by the time they turn 28, their investments would have grown in value to around $102,000. At this point, even if they never added another penny to their investments, their nest egg would grow to meet and actually exceed that $2.45 million target by the time they're 65. As a matter of fact, they'd reach it by the time they're 62 with a net worth of over $2.6 million. By the age of 60, they technically would have had enough money stashed away to be considered financially independent according to the 4% rule, as their $2.37 million net worth at that point is more than 25 times their age 60 annual expenses of roughly $87,000 a year. So we could say that sometime between their 27th and 28th birthdays, John and Jane achieved coasting financial independence. However, as I hinted at a minute ago, there are some caveats that we may want to take into consideration when making these calculations. The first one, that I'm sure many of you have already been thinking, is that we're assuming in this example that future market returns are going to be similar to the returns we've seen in the past. And while that isn't a totally unreasonable assumption, there is a lot of variability in market returns, especially when we're talking about stocks. Look at the decade of the 2000s, for instance. From 2000 to 2010, stock market investors essentially just treaded water. Contrast that to the previous decade. The 1990s were a booming time for the stock market, with average market returns clocking in well above 10% per year. The same could be said about the 2010s. However, it's worth noting that especially as the time horizon gets longer, the variability in long-term average market returns tends to get noticeably steadier. Just to illustrate that point, take a look at this chart showing the average, minimum, and maximum return figures for a variety of time horizons stretching from 1 year to 40 years using data from Robert Shiller's historical estimates on the S&P 500, which has returns dating back to 1871. As you can see, while there is still a non-negligible amount of variability even at the longer end of the spectrum, it's not nearly as big of a gap as it was in the 1, 3, or 5 year periods. What's more, we can adjust for this by adding in some artificial cushion to our return estimates. For example, what if we assumed a 7% per year return instead of 10%? Well, if we plug those numbers into a calculator, here are the updated results. Was it as big of a difference as you were expecting? It makes sense given how long of a time period we're examining here that there would be some difference, but John and Jane still managed to reach coasting financial independence and full financial independence within their desired time horizon. The second caveat is that we're assuming that the investor will utilize a broad-based market index fund approach, as opposed to investing in more focused assets like single stocks or single stock market sectors. And this may be a perfectly reasonable assumption for many investors. For instance, I myself am a long-term buy and hold index fund investor, but for others it may not fit well with their preferred method of investing. And that's perfectly fine, but it does mean that they are going to have to adjust a lot of their other assumptions, because there's just a lot more variability and uncertainty surrounding the long-term return prospects for any given individual stock than there is for the stock market as a whole. As I've covered in previous videos on this channel, even missing the 10 best days in the stock market could cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of an investing career, just as a result of how the math behind compounding growth works. And as Professor Hendrik Bessembinder discovered in his studies of the stock market's history, the majority of excess returns over the risk-free rate you could earn by simply investing in short-term treasury bills comes from a very small portion of companies in the stock market. And that pattern holds not just in the US, but worldwide. Basically, the long and short of it is, while you do have some chance of knocking it out of the park when investing in a more focused pocket of a market, there's also a chance that you will underperform the market as a whole, either because you miss out on a couple of good days or because you don't hit on enough of the shockingly small number of big winners there are before they take off. This substantial relative increase in uncertainty means that anyone taking this approach is probably going to want to put a bigger cushion on their growth estimates than they would if they had taken a more broad-based approach. As they say, plan for the worst, hope for the best. The third caveat is that we're assuming that the 4% rule will actually hold up in the future. That's not a guarantee. Even if it would take a heck of a lot for the 4% rule to fail, as you can see from this chart detailing the minimum, average, and maximum 30-year safe withdrawal rates for a classic 60% stock, 40% bond portfolio since 1928. So while it is statistically unlikely for the 4% rule to fail if followed as originally intended, in order to sleep better at night, it's possible that some people will want to build in a bit of cushion there as well by increasing our savings goal to some degree, or supplementing our strategy with techniques like cash buffers, flexible spending budgets, financial guardrails, lower burn rates, optimized asset allocations, and so on to make it less likely that we'll outlive our savings. Say John and Jane assumed that they could only safely withdraw 3.5% of their nest egg instead of 4%. This means that they would need to put away almost 29 times their annual expenses instead of the 25 times we previously assumed to achieve full financial independence. If we update our calculations once more, we can see that using a 7% annualized average return figure and a 3.5% safe withdrawal rate, John and Jane reach coasting financial independence at the age of 32. So at this point, we've added a good 5 years onto the time horizon for reaching coasting FI compared to the original hypothetical. That's not nothing, of course, but considering that we've slashed our return assumptions by nearly a third and have raised our requirements for saving, it could be worse. A fourth caveat is that we're assuming the expenses of our pre-financial independence lifestyle are going to match those of our post-financial independence lifestyle, at least once the impacts of inflation have been taken into account. But as I stated earlier, that isn't always going to be the case. Sometimes our expenses will increase after reaching financial independence, either because we've taken our foot off the gas a little bit and have allowed ourselves to spend more freely than we did when we were saving more aggressively, or simply because lifestyle changes introduce more expenses than they remove. Of course, in some cases, it can go the other way. In fact, statistically speaking, most people who reach financial independence and retire tend to see their inflation-adjusted spending decrease after making the transition, because the savings that they get from things like not having to commute to and from work and eat out as much for lunch, or just living a lifestyle that's a little slower paced than when they were working, outweigh whatever it is they add to their lifestyle. I've covered this phenomenon before. It's known as the retirement spending smile, which is basically just the shape that a typical retiree's inflation-adjusted expenses take when plotted on a graph over time. Generally, their inflation-adjusted spending steadily declines for a number of years after making the transition into retirement, before things like health-related costs start to rise fast enough to outpace the categories in their budget where they are saving money. So that's how to track your progress towards coasting financial independence, as well as some other caveats to keep in mind as you go along your journey. However, I haven't really touched on why I feel this concept is so relevant, especially in an economic environment that is experiencing some sort of turbulence and grappling with rising costs. So let's get into that. Why do I like the concept behind coasting financial independence, especially in this type of environment? Well, it may sound counterintuitive at first, but I think it largely comes down to the fact that coasting financial independence is a bit more wishy-washy than a lot of other financial goals that we strive toward, which sounds a bit more negative than I mean it to. Wishy-washy is a term that carries quite a bit of baggage, but what I mean is that by its very nature, coasting FI is a bit of a moving target, as we just saw in the last section, which I feel can actually be kind of a blessing when we're already feeling some financial pressure from the outside. Let me explain. Our coasting financial independence savings target is a number that's determined in part by the things we can control, i.e. our spending and the age at which we wish to reach full financial independence. Therefore, there's a real opportunity for optimization, which incentivizes us to make certain decisions that can prove very beneficial to us long-term, financially and otherwise. Some of these decisions include finding ways to experiment and learn more about ourselves and what we really want out of life, so that we can adopt a more enjoyable, but frugal and financially efficient lifestyle, or embracing the idea of switching to a more consistent and reliable investing approach, which in some cases may also have the added benefit of lowering our stress and helping us to sleep better at night, and even start seeking out new ways to earn money more enjoyably, whether that be through a job change, a side hustle, a part-time gig, or something else entirely. The goal would not necessarily be to maximize our income, although that certainly would be one consideration. The goal would be to find a way that we could enjoyably and sustainably produce an income for ourselves so that we can push back the date that we wish to achieve full financial independence as far as possible, since that allows our investments more time to compound and grow, thus making our overall chances of lasting financial success more likely. That still doesn't mean we couldn't try to reach full financial independence as early as possible. It would just mean that we're okay with reaching it a little later on than we were before, because we're more satisfied with life and our finances in the present. And especially in moments when we're not in the best place financially, or just life in general, these kind of incentives can be particularly powerful, because we can see, vividly, how much our lives could change for the better once we reach towards this goal. And I think that's why I love the concept so much, especially in this type of environment. The things that it incentivizes us to do in order to have the best chances of success are the things that pay dividends immediately and long after the goal has been reached. And those kind of benefits go well beyond the balance sheet. But that'll do it for me today. Once again, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to smash that like button if you haven't already, subscribe, and hit that bell next to my name so you'll be notified of all my future uploads. I generally upload every single Monday, and if you have a friend that would be interested in this kind of content, be sure to share it with them. Let's really get this information out there and start our own financial revolution.